teachers. The governor of Washington State made a reference to tweets, but he also didn't like guns in the classroom. And the president turned around and said, well, what do you think to the governor of Texas? Well, obviously, that was a different answer.
Yeah, but did you see his body language when talking to the governor of Washington?
Well, yeah, I thought he was quite controlled, actually.
Really? I mean, that whole arms folded, sour look on his face, like he was tapping his foot, just ready to go lose his mind completely.
But he didn't say little governor or little hands or.
Well, okay, good point. Good point. He could have gone off on some bizarre tirade about apples or something.
Exactly. It is what it is.
Sorry, if it weren't so tragic and it's so just plain ridiculous, it would be hysterical. You couldn't write this script for a bad made-for-TV movie.
Well, it's unconventional, to say the least. I've been in politics 45 some years, and it's unconventional. He does do better in those elements. Now, he did say, okay, come on, who else wants to talk? Come on, why are you so quiet? And then it ended.
Yeah.
Well, but the whole issue went beyond what normally it was going to be. It was going to be about governors, the infrastructure, et cetera. And it, of course, was kind of one issue today.
Yeah, he was all over the map. I mean, it was kind of bizarre. I do want to go back a second to the Janus thing, because you said something that just popped back into my head, that none of the people that you talked to today had really a sense of it at all. I mean, what kind of positions? Because you do a lot of right-wing shows. I can't imagine that they don't know that this was coming and that this was a right-wing, this was on the wet dream list. No.
Now, I will say, one of the ladies, I do her show in the New Hampshire area, Olga, she knew about this, was glad to bring it up. But beyond her, I would say most of the shows didn't know. No, they didn't know.
See, this has got to be one of those things that, like I said, on the wet dream list, that conservatives have, we're going to crush those unions, because it's really, it's the Machiavellian politic of, we're going to gut our enemy, which is the Democrats and those who fund the Democrats. So, I mean, it's, wow, I'm actually fairly shocked about that.
Well, I think, after I talked to you, and you had, been talking about the issue, I decided today to throw it out there. Because today was the beginning of the oral arguments.
Right.
I didn't, on all of our news feeds, right? It didn't come up on my screen. Wow. I got up this morning about 3:30. I put the news out. I think I sent it to you early in the morning too. I think I probably sent it around 4:30 or 5 today. And prior to that, nothing popped up on all my news feeds about the issue. Finally, I think it was NBC News or somebody had a blurb, but I had already put it out there, and it's just the way it was. I was in shock.
I guess it just shows where we are as a country. Just mind-blowing to me. I don't know. Anyway, Bob, I guess one other thing. The Supreme Court also today didn't take up Trump's immigration thing.
Right. So I'm glad you raised this, because it's a little confusing to people. The court didn't go against Trump or for him, but what they did say is this is in a lower case where he lost. Trump lost on the Dreamers, on DACA.
Right.
So they said, we're not going to hear this because we're going to bump it back. In other words, let it come up the food chain. Now, by bumping it back because he has lost and he has to appeal to another court before he can get towards the Supreme Court, that means as of tomorrow morning, the government has to start taking applications again for DACA starting tomorrow morning. Now, some people may say, okay, that solves it. It doesn't, though, because it's in limbo, because another court could rule different. It could keep going through the system. It could get to the Supreme Court. So if anybody wants to repair this, they still need to do it in the Congress. It's not done.
All right, good. Thanks, Bob. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Always great talking with you, Bob Ney, our good friend from Talk Media News. Quick break. Right back. Stick around. You're listening to The Rick Smith Show. For working people. Come to talk.
Radio of, for, and by we the working people. The Rick Smith Show.
I'm Rick Smith, and this is Labor History in 2. On this day in labor history, the year was 2011. That was the day the labor movement took an historic stand in Madison, Wisconsin. That cold Saturday, a crowd of union members and supporters swelled to more than 100,000 people at the state capitol building. The protesters were there to march, sing, chant, and stand defiant against anti-union legislation proposed by Wisconsin's Republican Governor Scott Walker. Known as Act 10, the legislation aimed to slash union rights of public sector workers. The protests at the Capitol had begun with a small crowd on Valentine's Day. Nearly 2 weeks later, historian Stuart Leventon called the protests the biggest crowds in Madison's history. As protesters marched, famous supporters and labor leaders gave speeches. Peter Yarrow of the musical group Peter, Paul, and Mary exhorted to the crowd, "The eyes of the world are on you." And he was right. Media coverage of the massive protests dominated news channels. Labor was taking a stand. Yet despite the massive protest, the Wisconsin Republicans had a supermajority in the legislature to pass their anti-union attacks. Since 2011, they have expanded their attacks to the private sector as well, passing a statewide right-to-work law. The impact has been devastating to working people in Wisconsin. Public sector workers have had to pay more for health care and retirement, losing 10% of their real wages. Governor Walker had promised to create 250,000 new jobs during his first term. He could not even deliver half that amount. By the summer of 2015, Wisconsin median family income growth ranked 50th in the nation. Those who marched in Madison could see these dark days coming. What will it take to stop these attacks on working people?
From United Nations headquarters in New York, this is your World in 2 Minutes. I'm your host, Luke Vargas, for Talk Media News. The UN Security Council passed a resolution Saturday calling for a 30-day ceasefire across Syria. The council was racing to stop civilian deaths caused by the Assad government's assault on the Damascus suburb of Ghouta. The UN vote was repeatedly delayed as the Syrian government worked to add in specific language allowing operations against terrorists affiliated with the Islamic State or al-Qaeda to continue. But less than 2 days after the resolution kicked in, the list of violations is already long and includes the very areas the international community was most concerned about. The Syrian government has now said its bombing of Ghouta is an anti-terror operation and will continue, and even Turkey is trying to take advantage of the terrorism loophole, arguing that a military invasion in northwestern Syria targeting Kurds allied with the U.S. is an anti-terror mission, despite the fact that the Kurdish groups under attack aren't designated by the Security Council as terrorists. Time and again, in the 7-year Syrian civil war, countering lawlessness with more laws never seems to work. And get used to the phrase Chinese President Xi Jinping. Xi is wrapping up the first of 2 5-year terms in office, and his re-election has never been in doubt. But over the weekend, China's Communist Party announced its intention to abolish term limits, clearing the way for Xi to stick around once his official term runs out in 2023. China doesn't need to look back far for reminders about why it instituted term limits in the first place. China's leader in the 1980s, Deng Xiaoping, helped create what he called a retirement system for the country's rulers, recommending term limits to stop the rise of leaders like Mao Zedong and the cult of personality that kept him in charge for 33 years. For more global news headlines, visit TalkMediaNews.com.
Remembering that united we bargain, divided we beg. Rick Smith.
To this battle, take my union gun. Gonna end this world of slavery, for this war is one you're bound to lose. Are you fascists are bound to lose?
Welcome back to the Rick Smith Show. Check out the website, thericksmithshow.com. Questions, comments, something on your mind, you can email me, Rick at thericksmithshow.com. Case Blue had an interesting tweet that I find interesting. He says, "Dear institutional investor, sovereign wealth fund, the Republican Party wants you to know they fully intend to force corporations to decide between compliance with radical conservative ideology and their fiduciary duty to act in the shareholders' best financial interest. And that's in response to the lieutenant governor from Georgia saying that, Delta, if you don't go back, we're going to screw you. Again, it's interesting to see how the radical right wing of this country is very flexible with their ideology when it comes to them, but very rigid in their ideology when it's anything outside of them. Just very, very twisted and bizarre. And, I look at that statement that, the lieutenant governor of Georgia is saying that they're going to use the government of Georgia against Delta Airlines for having made the choice to no longer have any relationship with the NRA. Think about that for a second. This is the kind of fascist government that we fought a war against. That's the kind of thinking that we fought against. And these are the same people who want to use government as a bludgeon over the head of workers. They talk about freedom. They talk about liberty. They talk about all of getting government off our back. Yet here they are. And when I was at the RNC convention in 2016, I had a sticker on the front of my laptop that said, right to work is wrong. And, all of the conservatives want to come up and argue. And they wanted to, you're wrong and right to work's right. And I said, as a conservative, if you are a true conservative, why do you want your government involved between you and your employer? Why do you want to put the government between you and the employer? Even if the employer is the government, why do you want to put the thumb on the balance, on the scale that heavily? And oddly enough, some of them at that moment standing in front of me on Radio Row were like, hadn't thought of it that way. Hadn't thought of, we talk about being anti-government, but this really is using government as a bludgeon. And I'm like, look, you're the one who says you want the freedom and liberty to negotiate. And you're the one who say you believe in democracy. Well, workplace democracy is that workers have the right to collectively bargain. And you know what? In a democracy, the majority has the power. Now, nobody is saying that you have to be a union member, a card-carrying union member, but you do have to pay for the benefits that you get. And look, the idea of, we'll just not give them benefits is ludicrous. That is not functional, and it's idiotic. But something that conservatives might throw out there because, hey, it's going to make the workers' ability to bargain that much weaker. This is all about restoring power to the wealth class. This is all about restoring power to capital. Because understand, no matter where you think you are on that scale, there is always the war between capital and labor, between moneyed interests and worker interest. And I don't care if you're a doctor, a lawyer, a brain surgeon, or if you're someone who sweeps up after them. You're still punching a clock, getting a paycheck, and you're making less or you're making more affects the moneyed interests. You make less, they make more. You make more, they make less. That's the balance. And what labor unions do is they want to sit at a table and make that balance a little fairer. And sadly, what's happened is as labor unions have gotten weaker and weaker, what we've seen is, that balance going more towards the wealthy and less towards the worker. It is that simple. Nothing more than that. And this decision that I expect in June is going to continue to put more power in the hands of the wealth class and capital and less in the hands of workers. And it's going to put more of the government in between workers and their employer. And that is not a good thing. Not a good thing at all. Anyway, if you missed any of today's program, thericksmithshow.com. That's where you go to get the podcast, the Rick Smith Show app on the smartphone. Take the program on the go, wherever you go. And as always, you can email me, rick@thericksmithshow.com. Thanks so much for tuning in. We'll see you back here tomorrow.